Good evening and most welcome to H731. And this is the end of the trilogy of Barbara Tversky. I call it last of the trilogy. She sums the whole thing up in two principles. The first principle is the principle of correspondence. The content and form of representation should match the content and form of the targeted concepts. The second is principle of use. The representation should promote efficient accomplishment of the targeted task. The two principles to be followed. Let's begin like this. What is your workspace? You can show here the working table. It's a bit messy, I'm sorry about that. I left all things here, candy. But this is your working space. This is where you work. Here you have your counter desk, your keyboard, your lamp, your stapler, your pens, notation marks, pens, rubbers, erasers. Or if you think about a team meeting or the serendipitous hallway exchange, these are interactions you're having with your environment and with other people. This is the space. You can also see your own mind as a workspace where you sort out things. How you think, how you gather.
Om du håller hårt, håll emot med vänster. Så ja.
You can sort ideas into piles, you can stack them up, you can take them apart, turn them over and turn them into other ideas. Here you have the principle once more about the Stone Age caveman who decontextualized. He put things under the depiction of maybe a hunting scene, then he decontextualized maybe the hunters, maybe the buffalo, and he can use the buffalo in a new context. He can count them and he can show them as possibilities of food of some sort. By putting them underneath, oddly enough always underneath, they get separated. And this becomes a workspace for the caveman in his mind as well. So he doesn't have to use the walls of the cave anymore. So you see here, action starts thinking and thinking promotes action. They go in a special relationship. And this is what Barbara Tversky means by mind in motion. It's a movement. I would say it's like a parallel movement. It's a movement in what we usually call exterior space, when you have some sort of idea like the caveman and he put it on the wall. But on the actual wall there is a movement as well, going from above to underneath. And that movement is also interesting and important here. So you understand here, doing communication becomes much more active, even more active than it was before. To communicate is not a passive transferal of information from one person to another, almost like you put a sort of communication line between subject A and subject B and transfer stuff, almost like a pipeline with, well, for instance, gasoline. It doesn't work that way. It's very active the whole way. And this is what I like, because this goes very, very clearly with modern research within neurology. Nobody today thinks that cognition is passive anymore. Cognition is active, and a cognition with no activity is no cognition anymore. She makes a really bold claim, and especially coming from Columbia University, which is not the pinnacle of the latest in neurology. I bring evidence to show, she says, that spatial thinking, acting in the world with the things in the world, is the foundation of thought. Not the entire edifice, but the foundation. Tversky's interest in thinking developed in counterpoint to the work of her late husband, the psychologist Amos Tversky, who was cooperating with whom?
Spivak.
No, Daniel Kahneman.
Yeah, Kahneman, thank you. But they were at the same university, Columbia. Spivak.
Yes, okay.
They had the Spivak.
Very good.
Spivak had her PhD at Columbia in 67,
Okay.
1976.
On what eventually became their Nobel Prize winning study of behavioral economics. And you see here, and that's actually a very interesting thing, here the difference between the different subjects is not that important. They actually fall together. Behavioral economics is an area we haven't touched in this series, but you see the space is the same. Above, under, decontextualization, recontextualization, referral, reference, parallelism, segue, and you name it. It's not mildly interesting, it's really interesting. Spatial thinking is something impressive in different parts because part of this we share with the animal kingdom. There is an ordering almost to the point as the animals do, although it's a level difference. They don't have a language, but they do spatial things. Actually, you could even say they are spatial things. And of course, among animals and among humans, we all have different levels of spatial awareness and the ability to manipulate spatial structures in our minds and in our hands. Well, you could say the most obvious, the most expressive way of showing spatial awareness and what you can do with spatiality is the arts, the crafts, technology, athletics, architecture. But it goes to show, here we can see we can't make a really pure difference between what we would call visual and spatial people and verbal people. The foundation is actually the same. The bad news, there is a bad news of course, but I think that's obvious. This is not taught in schools. Why would it be? It's completely new. The reason being, we have not come to understand the spatial foundation of thinking yet. We had researchers, we had pioneers, we had Lakoff, Johnson. If you should go really far deep into the stuff, you could actually say that Wittgenstein was one of the really first ones. But it's very hard to extract these specific ideas from Wittgenstein. But here it's laid out clear in the open. Mind in motion shows that spatiality is an ingredient that's not just an addendum, it's the foundation. It always goes back to that. But in order to make special of what you want to say, you need to know yourself as well as your receiver, your audience, because it's together with them that you co-cognize. You produce something in common, and therefore the addresser and the addressee are two very important nodes in this relationship. And this is something gets very much more flexible. Usually we have a very stagnant idea of subject-object. It usually means that when I'm talking here, I'm sending something off to you. I am the subject, you are the object. I am the sender, you are the receiver. As simple as that. Clear-cut difference. You're supposed to sit there, I talk. This is what Tversky are challenging. She's really challenging that. Because with spatial thinking, this could always be changed. Rather, there is a more flexible idea between receiver and sender. I think that's highly interesting. And what does this sound like? Usually, in this case, we prioritize one node, usually the subject, the one sending the thing, and the object is purely passive. And this you can find in very old cinematographic theories, but that's not the case anymore. Now we see the audience more like an active participatory ingredient in the whole equation. Today this has become deconstructed. Deconstructed in the most positive attitude of the word. It means you take more parts in. You are being more flexible. Of course, this holds, but that could be added with other aspects to give a fuller vision what it is to communicate. And this communication is so much more in depth, it's three-dimensional, and it's also reciprocal. It gives back, it's a feedback constantly going. One of the experiments I need to get back to, it's one of Tversky's more well-known experiments. And that's about communicating instructions for assembling a TV cart. And there you have effective explanations to balance these two principles. A drawing that shows all the individual pieces helps a person identify the parts. And this is important, step-by-step instructions tell them the order. The order is very important because here you need to put the subject in an order. This is what I call the path, Tversky called the path, that you walk the path as a subject, like an individual. It's you, Kalles, you, Henrik, who walk the path. That perspective is very important to understand something. But you can also back a little bit and you can look at the map, the instructions at distance. And now everything becomes more similar, but you can see differences in another aspect. You are approaching more what could be called representation. And I like this much more. Before we spoke about representation being something very far away, indefinitely far away, very far away, infinitely far away. And then you have reality being like this. But do you understand? Here it's a more flexible line. And she says, the more you go away the more distinct the things become. And the more you approach, the more you see differences. So sameness on a distance, then you have categories, you have definitions, you have species, you have sorts. You almost get to the Platonic forms, not that far I would say, but something in that vicinity. And you have sameness. Get into the narrow perspective and you see a lot of differences. You cannot make Platonic sense anymore, but you have more embodied knowledge of the whole stuff. And you only see differences. But there are so many places in between you can go. There's no definite either that or that. The same goes here. Communication could be seen as a clear-cut difference between subject and object. But you can have all the positions in between as well. So this calls for a more flexible way of seeing the whole thing. And maybe, I don't know, this is just me thinking rather late after sleeping 1.5 hours, maybe this could be a way into seeing this deconstruction in a more specific and knowable way. Because usual deconstruction is just saying, well, the world is not that simple. It's like a big difference between subject and object, between the polarization. You can change them. You can turn them topsy-turvy over, and then you understand reality is not that simple. And that's very good. But she takes the point even further. What can you do instead? It doesn't leave you stranded so you don't know what to do next. Because the thing is with deconstruction, you can end up in postmodernism. You give the whole project up because you see, well, it's not subject and object with a clear definition. And that's shown by the opposite, because you can turn the object and say that's more central and the subject is marginalized. And then you think to yourself, well, I'd rather give the whole thing up. I'm going to trust intuition or chance. Every time I think I should throw a dice instead. This is what has happened. And of course, Jordan Peterson is one of the chaps that pointed that out. That's why he accusing Derrida and Foucault of promoting that sort of thinking. Of course, that's not what they are doing or were doing, but it could actually lead to that result because they don't present something usable instead. But this is actually what Tversky does. And the really, really golden point she has, she doesn't invent anything. She says it's already out there for grabs. Language is already out there. We already have all these concepts like above, closer, nearness, distance, parallelism, reflection, you name it. Everything is there for a take, and even more so. You have loads of things to use. And here's a quote, nothing can get a room full of people to see, I see what you mean, quicker than a whiteboard sketch of the shape of the problem you're trying to solve and the intervention you are proposing. The whiteboard is really helpful. We're still using it to this day. Some people make good use of it. Maybe I did not tonight. You can always accomplish more things with a graphic or an illustration of some sort. But compare once more to the workplace. See here, these are helping tools. They can also be neatly arranged. and that makes a change. Because to have things readily at hand and also the distance in between them, that's not unimportant. Desk discipline is actually quite important because that tells you what you are going to mentally do. No, the plate doesn't do any harm. It's actually a good illustration. I have been thinking those lines to prepare my desk before I go to bed. And then I know in the morning graphically what I'm supposed to do before my verbal thinking kicks in. And I'd say for me it takes like half an hour to an hour before I can express myself verbally in my head. But the visual is usually there. It's more primordial in one sense, and that's probably what Tversky means when she says it's the foundation. It's not everything. We do have language, but language cover not the foundation, not the highest level, but language cover what is in between the most abstract and between what is more foundational. And gestures are a really important part of that. And we mentioned Hans Rosling, and I had the time to at least 2 minutes check Rosling out. And to be a Swede, we're not the most expressive people in the world. We're usually more like a refrigerator, we say. A Swedish person looks like a refrigerator. We don't have much body language. This is a very common sign in Sweden. Really welcome to my party. This is how we express our faces when we say I'm so happy. But Hans Rosling is nothing like that. He is not moving his own face, he's moving his hands, and he's actually moving his own body over the scene. And I think it's that intuitive feeling Hans Rosling had, I should say, because he expresses with his drawings something that would be incomprehensible, just because we already had a very clear image how the world was. And well, let me tell you how persistent such a worldview could be. I grew up in the Cold War. That meant I divided the world in 2 parts. Whereas Hans Rosling is trying to show that the part north and south, well, generally speaking, north and south, the north being more rich, the south being more poor. I had an east and west division as well. And that was, east was dictatorship, it was communism. There was one big block actually. It was there. It was Soviet Union, it was the eastern countries, and then you had China, you had North Korea, Mongolia. They were all interconnected as well. And that made that really visual. And that's still in my imagery. It's very hard to get around. I still think about these countries to be different to some sort. And that could cause problems. That it's a hanging on category that needs to be defocused. I need to zoom out to make another zooming. Because if I stick to that, it doesn't make any sense at all in the modern world. That gestalt, or whatever you call it, it's not useful anymore. And also, even if I was still in the Cold War, at some certain instances it could be better to defocalize, and you can get surprises and you can understand something in a new way. That happens. That did actually happen during the Cold War. For some mad reason, one country decided not to participate in the biggest propaganda gesture ever during the Cold War, and that was the Olympics in the United States. But one of the countries still went, and that was Romania. That was really weird. That surprised everyone, because we had a gestalt, even me living in Sweden, having no connection either to Romania or United States, that shocked us. But that goes to show that we need to refocal, and this is the same as the cavemen did. They decontextualize, they took certain parts of the picture out. They used the first graphic depiction ever to do that. And this goes to show how important this is. And in contrast, what people always been thinking, those cavemen wanted to depict the world in a beautiful way. They did much more than so. I don't say anything about the beauty of what they did on the cave paintings. That's quite extraordinary. Lavasco is today really a big piece of art, there's no doubt. But they did even more. Isn't that amazing? They did the first abstract thinking depicted in human history. And that opened up so much, so incredibly much. And I come to realize the event of civilization is so much more than I ever thought about before. It becomes so much grander in the description of Barbara Tversky. And she doesn't try to heighten it up. She does it indirectly. You understand the grandeur of thinking, of what abstraction can do for you, and what an important tool it is. And it's also constantly developing. I actually was in need of something I didn't find in Tversky's book. Well, I already looked into the index, but I would like that she took up Shakespeare. Shakespeare made excellent use of space. Not only did he add, I think, a lot of something in the vicinity of 100 words to the English language. All those words were new spaces, because he used the old spaces to create these words. He used the theatre scene so we directly could understand what the new word meant. He was a genius in that way, because you need a language game to give this new word a meaning. What could be better than a theatrical setting? That's what he was using. And his genius was not only to invent new words, but he put them directly into the sonnets, into the action. They were already active by the time he threw them in. They were not static, they were already active. And I think that was actually one of the first cases of a mass invention of words. It happened before, but here it happened on a great scale. And he used the spaciousness of the theatre scene. And it doesn't matter immensely much. Of course, it's better to have it in the globe with real actors, because then the spaciousness would be evidently clear. It will be incredibly seductive. It will impinge on you. But also in the written format, he uses spaciousness. Every type of written thing is a use of space, of differences, of above, underneath, to the right. Also the reading sequence, which is not unimportant. And the written language can show this in other ways than the talked language, making things even more implicit, more complicated, more interesting. And she also showed a dilemma that became very obvious in the last 2 years with the pandemic. And that is, now in these times where less human contact, will be using much more emails and video conferences. And that has led to an enormous amount of so-called mistakes. But another way of viewing it is not as mistakes. It's rather that one aspect of the spatial is not presented as clearly as before. It's harder to get the spatiality over an email. It's a bit easier in a video conference, but it's still sort of hard because my theater becomes much restricted because I have a camera, I have to keep on a distance on the camera. My approaches to the camera is not as clear as my approaches in real life because you don't feel the warmth of my body or the nearness of my body. That is a big difference. And that is something is made use in spatiality. We need to understand that adds a certain extra to language, and it could actually change meaning completely. Nothing is completely set in stone. And speaking about Romania, there is an example coming from there, and that was the last speech of the man who decided that Romania should join the Olympics. Despite the direct order from Moscow, nobody was supposed to participate in this capitalist game. Because of the Cold War, Romania opted to stay with their own line and join. And they were applauded by the whole world. Because of distance, all the Eastern European countries looked the same. But we were able to see them as a whole. That's distancing. That's what distancing helps with. But that could also lead to some problem. It was a mistake, we found out later, to think that Romania was actually a complete part of this cluster of countries, 7 or 8 were they. It was actually completely different. It was ruled by a megalomaniac dictator. We had no idea. But the last speech of the dictator, there was sort of an implicit knowledge that he was a megalomaniac dictator. What he did in Bucharest was incredible. I saw with my own eyes. He took the old city. I strolled around it. It was beautiful. He tore the whole thing down, and he built the biggest palace in modern time. And I think he built it from Italian marble, if I'm not misinformed. It looked incredible to have this big house in the middle of town. He had a megalomania. His wife had an even more so. But the last speech was sort of interesting because people came to a speech with an enthusiasm they'd never seen before. They were really, really enthusiastic about Ceausescu. But something happened here. When he began his speech, he used the same dramatic liturgia as he always did, but then he became personal, which I think normally would add extra flavor to the speech to make it more deep, because then you get the body in somehow. You get nearer to the public. So first you have this distance speech, which is good because that depicts everything very clearly. What is communism? What are our goals? And it's being polite at the same time. But then he got closer, became to be personal. But what happened was really unexpected. But understanding spaciousness, it makes more sense. When he became more personal, he encouraged people to see him as a human being, as a friend. Listen to this. He was all of a sudden a friend. He was a human being. He had a heart, he had a body, he has vein. And all of a sudden, when they went back to the other mood, from a very big distance, him being very much above, it didn't ring true anymore. Because this was a human being saying these things. And people started to shout very quickly. And within a couple of minutes, for the first time in 45 years, they started to shouting bad things to him. And it all changed in this instance because of differences in speciality. I don't know what would have happened if he stayed impersonal at a distance. I think this could have happened, but not as quick, because the revolution started here. And it didn't start that intentional. There was some intentional acts going on, but it's very interesting. And with this speciality, you learn to understand how does it work. Mind is no longer something terra incognita. It's no longer the black Africa, black in the sense being unknown, as he used to be on the old maps until Livingstone and Stanley got there. No, now we're getting into the mind and we see what it really does. So in a way, Barbara Tversky does much more than even the neurologist had done to this point. She actually shows what the mind is capable of and what we are doing on a daily basis. And this is just extraordinary. I think I'm going to end this lecture here. This is the end of the introductory trilogy of Barbara Tversky. Now I need to take a rest from her, but I hope I can get back in a couple of weeks with the details, because that's going to make you even more enticed when you can actually use what she's saying. But that's for the future. I say thank you very much. Have a good night.